Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Grant McAllister. I'm a DP here in Los Angeles, and in today's episode, we're going to break down the lighting for an episode of Gibson Guitars Through the Lens series, featuring acclaimed photographer Henry Diltz. In this episode of Through the Lens, photographer Henry Diltz discusses his relationship working with Neil Young in the 1960s and 70s through his recordings with Buffalo Springfield and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young.
Well, I know I met Neil Young in '66 because the first actual group that I photographed was the Buffalo Springfield, because Stephen Stills had been my friend for 3 or 4 years. I met him in '63 in New York City when we were playing at the Village Gate, and he was playing a little coffee house. And one day in Laurel Canyon, I heard some guitar music coming out of a house, and I walked up, and Stephen Stills was in there visiting a friend. He said, "Hey, Henry, we're going down to Redondo Beach this afternoon to do a sound check," meaning the Buffalo Springfield. He said, "Do you want to come along?" And I thought, yes, because I can go out on the beach and get some pictures for my slideshow. As I walked back to the club,
I really enjoy shooting this series because it gives you an insight into some of these historic images you've seen from these acclaimed photographers and a little bit of a peek into their process, which, as someone who breaks down his own work, I thoroughly enjoy. So yeah, let's get into it. We shot this episode at the Dresden, which is a classic bar and lounge here in LA, and it was prominently featured in Doug Liman's film Swingers with Jon Favreau and Vince Vaughn. One of the initial difficulties we ran into with this job was not being able to do an in-person location scout. So I turned to the internet for some research and came up with a lot of great photographs that helped me get a sense of the space. I compiled all the photos I had gathered online together and created a rough lighting diagram based on what I thought would be the best approach. There were some things in these photos that I noticed that could be an issue and ended up actually being a bit of an issue when we got there. Mainly that there is a very large piano here in the middle of the room that can't be moved. It's just part of the location. It's got, historic and intrinsic value. And so it's definitely something that we had to work around. It limited our options for where we could set up our cameras and lights and place our interview subject. So we had to get creative with working around that. For the interview, we did a little bit of moving around of some of the tables in the bar, just to create some space for us, as well as separate our subject from the rest of the background. We initially looked at him sitting at one of the tables, but the table just felt too big and it was kind of awkward framing with the table there. So we ended up flying it out and just had him sit kind of separate from the tables in the restaurant. Once the tables and chairs and everything were moved, we started to bring in some of our lighting. In my initial lighting diagram, I had 2 Nanlite Forza 500Cs that were going to go through an 8x8 diffusion. But with just how the bar was laid out and the space we had allotted, that really wasn't going to work out for us. The area that we could get the light, behind the bar wasn't tall enough to fill out kind of the whole 8x8 frame. So we ended up going with a single Nanlite Forza 500C in an Aperture Dome 150 softbox with a grid attached to it to control some of the spill. Even with the grid on, there was still a lot of spill in the background. We used a couple of 4x4 solids to block off the light and help shape it solely on the subject here. It ended up becoming a little bit of a grip forest because we really wanted to block out enough light to minimize the spill in the background and some of the light pollution to help keep our atmosphere throughout the scene. So we have our stand-in here sitting in, and you can see here there's a lot of spill off to the right-hand side of the frame, which was kind of adding a little bit too much fill in on the image. So we added an additional 4x4 solid in there as well, just to kind of help minimize that spill. Once we got our key light into place, we added in our backlight. For this, we used a Amaran F22C, and we armed that out on a Mini Max Menace arm. This is a really great piece of grip gear. I use it all the time on these interview setups. It's great for small spaces and has a pretty decent reach to it as well. We initially had the Amaran without a control grid on it, but that created a lot more spill in the background that we wanted to get rid of. So we put a grid on the F22C, and that helped control the spill a lot, but it was also removing too much from the background on the subject. We took the grid off one of the corners and had it draping down. It minimized the spill on the background while still keeping the backlight on the subject. With those two lights in place, it was time to add a couple of accent lights just to help fill out the space and create a more cozy and inviting look, reminiscent to kind of a 70s club. We utilized a lot of candles in the bar that added a lot of depth into the background, as well as little pops of light here and there. It made the bar feel a little bit more lively, like you had just sat down with Henry here to have a conversation while the bar was closing up. I wanted to give the bar a little bit more texture, and in the background here, I added two 4-foot Titan tubes that we zip-lined to purse hooks. That helped add a little bit more contrast and highlight the leather on the bar stools. Without those on, the bar just felt really dark and flat. I also placed a couple of Aperture B7C bulbs around on the sort of fire flicker mode to imitate the candles that were existing on set. One thing that I like to do in my interview setups is shoot through foreground elements to add a little bit of visual depth and interest. So we placed a couple of glasses and water bottles in front of the lens out of focus and highlighted those with some of the existing candles and some B7C bulbs off camera that not only acted as an eye light, but gave the reflections in the foreground a little bit more life. Once our main lighting here in the bar was set, we started working on the deep background. There's a recessed light here that we kept on right behind our talent to add a little bit more of that salt and pepper lighting. In the far background here, we set up a haze machine. We added a Aperture 300X with a 26-degree spotlight on it in the background there to add some smokiness and layers to the background. We had that cutting through and hitting the bar glasses here in this wide shot. You can see the little bit of kicks of light and reflections, and it also added a little bit of visual depth in the background with the haze, which made the bar feel a little bit more lively and lived in. Additionally, we lit up these red stained glass windows in the background with an Aperture Nova P300C that we set up, I think just on apple blocks in the background low, shooting it into those windows just to add some extra pops of color and light. Our last bit for lighting here was a 4x4 poly board that we wrapped in unbleached muslin. Initially, we had it set on one of the booths to the right of the camera, but it was a little bit too far away to provide much bounce. So we moved it to be a little bit more of a frontal bounce, and we shot an Aperture 120D with some full CTO on that into the bounce to not only act as a little bit of an eye light, but fill in the shadows. Altogether, I think that this really came out nicely. There were a lot of different layers here in the lighting. It was great to be able to do a single lighting setup, and it gave us time to dial in a more cohesive look. With our lighting dialed in, let's get into the cameras. We shot this on 4 C500 Mark IIs with Canon CN-E lenses and a 1/8 black pro mist on each lens to help accentuate some of the haze and soften the skin tones. Our A-cam wide was on a 24mm, our B camera was on a 50mm, pushing in and out on a Dana dolly. Our C camera getting the medium shot was an 85mm, and lastly, our D camera here was a 135, and that was getting the profile shot. All of our cameras are sucked up right next to the piano here, as close to it as we can get, to get us as far back in our space. And you can see our D camera here is even operating from sort of behind the piano. So the piano being this immovable object did limit a lot of our options for where we could set our lights and our cameras up. So we had to sort of work around that. Ultimately, we ended up with some pretty nice looking frames. My initial conversation with the director was to shoot into the corner booth here as sort of a nod to some of the scenes in the booths in Swingers, I think. But when we got there on the day, it ended up just feeling pretty flat. So I decided to change our camera position up a little bit from the initial lighting plan and shoot more towards this background here. I think it added a lot more depth and layers between the rocks in the background, the pinstripe wood, seeing more of the bar details, and into that back room. That just made the space feel a little bit livelier. So that decision to shoot the opposite direction from where we had scouted gave us a lot more visual interest and added a lot more depth to the image. One trick I like to do when working with the C500s and various other camera models is to use my onboard monitor as a reference for the main image and use the built-in monitor, whether that's on the eyepiece on like an Alexa Mini or the little onboard monitor here on the Canon. I use that to check critical focus. So I'll have that magnified in and focused in on the eyes so I can quickly check that as a reference for focus, especially when I'm pulling focus myself. That's just a great way to have a quick check at a glance to tell critical focus. Additionally, I like to add a hotkey for false color that only feeds to that monitor, so you're not seeing it at Video Village or on your onboard monitor. That's a great way to just quickly check where you're at for exposure without disrupting the workflow for the producer, director, or anyone who might be looking at the Video Village monitor or your onboard monitor. So that's a quick tip that I've picked up for working with these cameras and being able to check your focus and exposure on the fly. So before we wrap things up, I wanted to touch briefly on working with your stand-in. Oftentimes you'll do your lighting with a stand-in as a reference, so you can get a sense for what your lighting's gonna look like on a person instead of an empty chair. Once your talent arrives, you need to make sure that you're allotting a couple of minutes to make final adjustments and tweaks to your lighting, because your lighting will probably change, once you see your actual subject in the seat. For example, Henry's eyes are a lot more deep set than our stand-in, and his skin tone is very different. So we had to take a quick minute to adjust our lighting, and it's important to communicate that with your assistant director. I know there's a tendency to want to just shoot right away once the talent is there due to their limited amount of time you have them, but it's important to fight for that time and say, look, I need a couple of minutes here just to dial in the lighting now that we see the actual subject here. Because no one is going to fight for that other than you. It's your job and responsibility as the cinematographer to kind of be the protector of the image. So if you want to make it look as good as you can, you're going to need to voice that you need the time to make some small adjustments before you start rolling with your actual subject. It can be as simple as dialing down the intensity on a light, or making a quick adjustment to move the light around to shape the light on the face better. So that does it for this breakdown. Thank you again so much for watching. If you have any questions, make sure you leave a comment below. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more updates and breakdowns coming up. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.